Okay. Hello, everyone. I think we have a good number of people starting to come in. Just going to introduce myself and thank you for joining. So for anyone that doesn't know me, my name is Kathy Daniels, and I work as the core facility manager at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. Clearly, I'm not there right now. I think many people are actually working from home, and you can hear the clock going off in the background since I'm currently at home. But we just want to really thank everyone. We've gotten a pretty good response to this intro to FlowJo session. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to really go over some of the basics of FlowJo. We got an overwhelming response, and we're really happy to have gotten that response. And we did see a variety of different topic requests, going anywhere from basic gating and everything like that up into some more advanced multicolor stuff, Teasney and all of that. So what we're going to do throughout today is we're going to go through more of the basics. Please know that if you have any questions, we do have the chat function, and you can raise your hand and you can ask questions. And Rui Gardner, the head of the facility, is also on the call, and he's going to be fielding those questions. And anything that pops up, either we'll start talking about it, any questions throughout the talk itself, or we'll address those more towards the end of the talk. Okay. So again, this is going to be more of an intro. We're just going to give it a minute or two to let people, sign in. And I really want to say also that I hope everyone is home as much as they can, that they're staying safe. We're all in this together, and, I'm lucky to say that my family and everyone I know is okay right now here in New York, but I hope the same for everyone else and their families, that everyone's staying safe as well. Okay, so I think a couple minutes in, we're good to get started. Some people are still joining, but what we're going to do is just go over a couple of slides first to talk about, what the goal is for today. So here's our little dot plot saying today is going to be an intro to FlowJo version 10. So it's not going to be version 9, but version 10 for today, hosted by the Flow Cytometry Core Facility at MSK. Okay. So some of the topics that we're going to be discussing today, a general overview of the software itself. How do you import samples? How do you do gating? How do you make group-specific samples? We do have a couple of different data sets. There are a lot of people that asked about calculating compensation, so we're going to be doing that. I'm also going to be bringing in a titration data set where we can really get a good look at calculating optimal concentrations, whether or not, we want to look at certain concentrations for certain antibodies. How do we really determine that? Concatenating files together to get a nice visualization of multiple files, batch processing for multiple samples in a group, and also some data overlays, which I think a lot of people are interested in also. Click. All right, so some important links for you guys. We want to thank FlowJo. They've been wonderful in providing a free 30-day license to FlowJo for anyone who might have been working on shared computers and are now forced to work from home. They really were very proactive in offering a license for people to be able to work from home. So the link to that is right up top, and we are going to share these slides, and also we're recording this session today so that you'll have access to it after, in case you don't get the chance to write it down. Our facility website is fccf.mskcc.org, and our Twitter's handles at FlowMSKCC. So we are always trying to push out educational content, SOPs, any announcements, anything in the area will be here and available for you on both of these sites. ISAC, pretty self-explanatory, but we want to make sure that we recognize their contributions to cytometrists. And they've also gone ahead and made Cyto University, their educational content, free and available for the time being, given the current state of what's going on and so many people being forced to work from home. Flow Repository is a nice website to go to if you might not have any FCS files, you're just starting to get into Flow, but you're wanting to start to learn how to use FlowJo. So Flow repository will have FCS files that are available that you can go and you can download onto your personal computer or work computer, whatever it is, and be able to start playing around with some analysis. Okay. More important links, we have the Cytometry Part A journal that you can go to for educational content for flow cytometry and research articles and journals as well. MetroFlow is the local New York, New Jersey flow cytometry users group, and we meet twice a year. We'll have a vendors meeting in July, and we'll also have our yearly meeting in October. So check us out to get more information on that. And lastly, I wanted to give credit. That first slide where we did the intro to Flow was converting an image to an FCS file from David Gravano. We want to say thank you for that. And this is the reference to be able to do it. Okay. Again, I want to stress if anyone has any questions throughout this talk, please reach out to either Rui Gardner or myself. And that is Daniel K1 and not Daniel KL, so at mskcc.org. So that's a 1 after there, and Gardner at mskcc.org. We're absolutely open to any questions that you might have after this. But again, throughout the duration of the talk, if you do have any questions or comments, please just let us know and we'll be happy to discuss them during the talk. Okay. And lastly, I want to say thank you to everyone in our facility. Everyone's been so wonderful throughout all of this and before. So this is our group. Very proud to have been able to join this group about 1.5 years ago, and they're an amazing group of people. So thank you to all of them. And we will go ahead and get started. Okay, now I have to escape out of this, and I hope that works. Okay, great. You have to forgive me, this is my first time doing a virtual classroom, so thank you for your patience. Okay. So the first thing that we really want to do is we want to go ahead and open up FlowJo, right? So for anyone that doesn't have it, you can go to the flowjo.com website and go to download. The most current version is 10.6.2. So when I go ahead and I open it up, what's going to happen is it's going to ask me to sign in. So unless you're in a unique circumstance, pretty much all of the sign-ins now for FlowJo are done via the portal. So I do have my account. So I'm just going to go ahead and sign in right here. Okay. And now it's going to go from unlicensed, and you can use demo samples only, to you being actually able to drag in real FCS files. Okay. So some people are not sure where to start. Do I add samples here? Do I go to a new workspace? You already have your workspace there. It's ready to get started. I typically don't tend to use the add samples dialog, but what I typically tend to do is I like to go to the folder where my files are and just drag them right in. So if I take this titration data right here and drag it in, what you'll notice is all of the FCS files that were in that folder, if I open it up right here, are already in the workspace now. Okay, so I don't have to go and individually drag or select all or do anything like that. All I have to do is drag in that titration data. Okay, now I'm going to actually delete these really quick because I want to show you something that you might be interested in. If I just hit the delete key, it lets me delete them. If I open that up and I had created a subfolder, say they weren't titration, they were some other samples, and I drag that in and I move those over there. When I bring this in, the titration data folder itself, now it gives me multiple groups. I have all samples, which will have every single FCS file that was in that titration data folder as a whole, but I also have a samples folder, or a samples group rather, which only has the 3 samples that I had dragged into that folder. So it creates a group for any subfolder within your main folder, okay? And then I also have the titration data, which was in the main one as well, okay? I do not need that. I just strictly did that to show you importing FCS files and the power of that and importing it through folders. So I'm going to go ahead and actually take these away. So you can go ahead and delete a group by just clicking delete on your keyboard. And then I'm strictly going to work from all samples because I don't need the specific titration data folder or group. Okay, so I'm going to delete that. Okay. Now, this is a set of titration data that was run on a plate, okay, and it's not labeled with specific markers or antibodies. I know what they are, so I'm going to explain it to you as I start opening it up. But one of the first things that we do is just double click to open up an FCS file. Okay, and what we see here is that traditional forward scatter, side scatter plot. Okay, and when we're looking at this, the first thing I notice is, all right, it's telling me 40% of the events are on the chart edges. That is not something that we want, right? Our data is off scale. So what do I want to do? The first thing I ask myself is, okay, do I remember which instrument this was run on? If I don't worry, it's okay. All you have to do is double click on this little circle right here. And when I do that, what's going to wind up happening is it's going to open up the properties of that FCS file. And all of the keywords specific to that FCS file are going to be found right here, okay? And as I'm hovering my mouse, what you see here is this $CYT, which is telling me it's from the Cytoflex, okay? So I know, all right, I know a little bit about the Cytoflex. I know that the range on the forward and side scatter is much different than it is on other instruments. And if I kind of move over here to the range, I can actually even see what that is, okay? So if I move this properties window over, what this is telling me here on the actual plot itself is that this is maxing out at 2 million, right, for forward scatter and side scatter. But if I look at this range, it's actually 16,777,216. So it makes sense that I'm not seeing all of my data in this plot right here, okay? So there are multiple things that you can do to address that. I'm going to show you all of them, or all the ones that I'm aware of. So if you click this transform button right here, you can go to customize axis, and where it says max, you can actually change it to that value, 16,777,216. Okay. Once I do that, you can see now all of my data, even though it's a bit, is a lot of white space, it's all on scale, and I'm looking at that full range. Okay. I can also do the same for other parameters, like side scatter, or if I was looking at forward scatter area, I could do the same thing, because that's all going to default to 2 million. Okay, so that's one method by using the transform button. The other method, I'm going to close these out so we don't get too cluttered, is going to be going to preferences. Okay, so if I go to preferences right here, this is the FlowJo preferences, and if I go down to the bottom and go to tools and cytometers, when I click on that button right there, it's going to recognize that the instrument was the Cytoflex, and right here there's custom log scaling and custom linear scaling, okay? And so you can see why it's popping up for me right now at 2 million, and it didn't automatically go to that 16,777,000. I see this fairly often with people coming in with data from other instruments that aren't BD instruments, where they're a little bit confused. So 2 things that you can do. One, you can say, okay, I know that number is 16,777,216. Or you can always try going to the default and see if that works out for you, okay? To see if it automatically recognizes with the FlowJo software. Okay. So once I do that, if I hit OK, it's actually going to require me to close out of the software and open it back up again for it to recognize that. So if I close it out, I'm not going to save the workspace, and I'm going to put a new one in very quickly to be able to drag that the titration data back in. And then once I click on that file again, you'll see it automatically goes to that scaling of 16 million for all of my forward scatter and side scatter parameters, and you don't have to individually use that transform button for each one, okay? So, sorry, my keyboard's a little wobbly down here. And then what you can do from there is you can go ahead and you can kind of adjust the scaling as you see fit for your forward and side scatter for the Cytoflex data, okay? The reason for that is one of the things I advise our users to do specifically to the Cytoflex is make sure that all of the data is within 1 to 5 million. Because if I change this to side scatter height and to forward scatter height, what you'll see is just above 5 million, it actually hits a point of saturation and you're not seeing anything go above that. So what we really want to make sure when we're at the instrument, actually as opposed to FlowJo, is that everything is within that 1 to 5 million, okay? But when we're sitting here and we're actually looking at the data, most of our data is actually within that range. And I can zoom in on that by clicking the transform button and customizing the axis. And I can change this, right, to about 5 million, okay? So when I look at that and I change that value of the max to 5 million and I apply, I'm getting a better visualization of the data, okay? I can do the same thing for side scatter and change that, maybe 5 million here, and apply, okay? Now that looks a lot better than what it did before at 2 million, and it looks even better than what it did at 2 million. So we're optimizing the scaling specific to the instrument to make sure it looks okay. And we also learned how to go ahead and make sure that our cytometer preferences are correct for the cytometer that we're working on. Okay, I like things nice and clean, so I'm going to delete those two groups that I didn't need from before when I made that subfolder. And I'm going to start going ahead with gating and taking a look at the titration and looking at the statistics and everything like that with this data set, okay? So everyone is going to gate a little bit differently. We're all human, we all have our preferences. The most important thing is that you're following the right principles, right? So some people might look at this and first want to pull out, you know, forward scatter and side scatter gating and then do singlets and then do viability. Personally, what I have a preference for at first is to really hone in on the viable cells. So I prefer, for some samples at least, to do a viability gating. So when I click on this little down arrow right here, it's going to give me all of the parameters available. So for this experiment, the viability was off of this channel, the red 760. Okay, so I'm going to look at area for my fluorescent data. And what I see here, I unfortunately do not have an unstained, but ideally what you would like to do is you'd like to gate based off of your unstained for setting any positive or negative gates, okay? I was in a little bit of a scramble to get data, so typically what we would do is we'd make sure we have that unstained. I just did not have that available for this data set, given the circumstances. So what I'll do is I'll click on the polygon. Okay, so there are different options for gating down here. So if I come here, every click is a node. And if I come up and make all of these clicks and then kind of double click or click at the original node, it's going to give me the option to name that population. So I'm going to call that live cells, okay? And I'm gonna hit okay. Now what I should have mentioned before is that there's also an option for rectangular gate, a quadrant gate, an elliptical gate, the polygon, and there's also this auto gate, right? So if I click on the auto gate right there, it might start going around the populations that are most dense. I don't typically tend to use that. The gate tools that I most use are the polygon, the elliptical, quadrant not so much, and also the rectangular, but it all depends on your needs. And there's also the hinge quadrant or spider gates, okay? So we do have all of these options here. We might not go through all of them today, but they are available to you and you can always explore them, okay? Now, one thing that I actually don't always love, you see how this annotation is popping up right in the middle? One of the biggest things when you're looking to analyze data and to display data, whether it's to your PI, lab manager, whoever it is, or publication, you don't want to start covering any of your data with annotation. So we're going to go back to the preferences real quick and change something now so that for the duration of the rest of our analysis, we don't have to worry about moving those names. So if I go to preferences right here, what I can do is I can go to gates within those preferences, and I can change the annotation position. So as opposed to it being inside, we can go above, below, to the left, to the right. I typically use above. It's your preference for whatever you'd like, but just know that that's there. This way you can use that so that you don't have to constantly change where your annotation is. You also don't necessarily, if you don't want the annotation in there and you want to manually put it in, you do have that availability in addition to adding percentages, adding population medians, any of that is available to you, okay? Another thing that you might see is sometimes you might see that people's gates don't necessarily look like this, and it might be a different color or a different thickness for the line. All of those options are here for you, right? So you can change the weight of the gate line or the gate lines themselves, and you can also change the color. So if I wanted to make it red and I wanted to make it pretty thick, I can go ahead and do that, but it's not my preference, so I'm going to leave it as it is, but just know that that's there for you as a tool. Okay. Now, once I go ahead and I click on that population, what you'll see now is I'm still on sample, or well, A2, and here it's only showing me what I've gated, all right? What I'm gonna do from there is I'm going to look at the singlets gate. So if I click here, there are multiple ways that you can go ahead and, look at singlets. One of the ways that I typically tend to do it is looking at area versus height. And when I do that, I tend to look at forward scatter height, forward scatter area to start off with, but know that that's not a hard set rule, okay? Certain samples might look better, side scatter height versus width, side scatter height versus area, area versus width. As long as you understand the fundamental principles of why you're gating on singlets, you're okay, okay? And make sure that the parameter matches up. So it should always be forward scatter versus forward scatter and side scatter versus side scatter. If I had side scatter height plotted versus forward scatter area, that would not work, okay? Now I need to zoom in, right? Because we made that adjustment on the transform for our forward scatter area, but we need to do that for our forward scatter height as well. So if I change that also to 5 million, okay, I'm now able to better visualize where my single cells are as opposed to my aggregates. Okay, a little bit of water. So I'm gonna then use the polygon tool again, and I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna gate on those single cells. So we know that as a single cell goes through, the height and the area should be somewhat proportional, and anything that's higher in area or width typically tends to be the aggregates of cells. So I know that if I set a nice tight gate here, I could be a little bit more liberal there on the height, and that's okay. And once I close that gate up, FlowJo is pretty smart. It's gonna say, hey, I know those gates. I'm pretty sure that those are your single cells. So I'm gonna go ahead and hit okay, right? I'm not going to do it today, but what you also have the option and the availability to do is to do another singlet gate. It doesn't hurt to do 2 singlet gates, right? So if I double clicked on that again and move this over, if I wanted to do side scatter area and side scatter height, and then again adjust this scaling, right? I know I'm going a little bit quick through that, but it's just doing the same thing that we already did. I think that's 5 million. Okay, so there are a couple of aggregates that I did potentially miss out on. So I know I said I wasn't going to do it, but I'm going to go back and do it because you can do 2 singlet gates. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. And it's not going to let me do 2 gates of the same name. So I'll call it single cells side scatter. Okay, there we go. All right, so now I have my viability gating. I have my first singlet, I have my second singlet. What I'm gonna do from there is double click on it, and then I'm gonna do my scatter gating. Okay, so I'm gonna look at my forward scatter, I'm gonna look at my side scatter. And for this experiment, we're looking at the lymphocytes. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna do an elliptical gate, and I'm gonna go ahead and put it on this smaller population of lymphocytes. Because I know for this researcher, the antibody that they were looking to titrate and the cells that they were looking for. So I'm going to go ahead and name those lymphocytes, or more importantly, what you can actually do is call it a scatter gate, right? You can't always use scatter as a metric to define what a population is. What you always should be doing rather is using a cluster of differentiation, a CD marker, to be able to pull out, are these my leukocytes, are these my red blood cells, what they are. You can't say with certainty what a cell is without a CD marker. So keep that in mind. So that's why I'm going to call this scatter as opposed to lymphocytes, okay? I want to make sure I'm using the correct terminology here, okay? You could always make a little bit of adjustment there. And then I'm going to double click, okay? And I know that the antibody that they were looking to analyze was off of this detector, okay? And this is the unstained, okay? So from there, what I can do is I can set up a gate around the negative and around the positive, because when we're looking at titration data and calculating optimal separation index, we need to make sure that we're taking into account the negative and the positive. It's not just about the positive population, okay? So I'm going to see how the side scatter area looks as a parameter to plot it against. I'm not going to promise that it's going to be the best, but we're going to take a look, okay? So I'm going to use the polygon. I'm going to come in here, and I tend to just be a little generous here. So even though the population wasn't necessarily going that high, I tend to keep it up. If you had a little bit more restrictive, that's perfectly fine. And I'm going to call it marker negative. If, or say for example, it was, maybe it's B220. I'll call it B220 negative. But again, all of this is very anecdotal. I'm not discussing markers or anything like that. It's just FlowJo itself. Okay, then I'll come in and I'll say, okay, I think my positive would be right about there. And I'm not sure how this gating is going to work, but I'm going to try it out. Okay, so I'm going to do B220. And you see it's smart, it starts typing it in for me. So if you want to just go ahead and have it fill it out and then replace to positive, you can. If you want to type out the whole thing, it's up to you. Okay. I'm going to hit OK. Okay. So now what you'll notice here is for this first sample, we have our live cell, single cell, our second single cell gate, and all the rest of the gates. What about the rest of my samples? Okay. So what you can do here, if my mouse is working, you can click on the live cells, hit your shift key, and come down and highlight the totality of that gating strategy, okay? And when I come up here and I go to all samples, what's gonna now happen is every single sample within the workspace is going to have that gating, okay? Now, if I had a specific group, I could drag that up to that group and it would only apply to that and no other groups, right? I'll show you that a little bit later on, but this is just a general gating strategy and how we're gonna approach it. Okay, so every sample might be a little bit different. So what I wanna do now is I wanna go ahead and I wanna adjust and check all of my gates. So my screen's not insanely big, right? But it's big enough. And what I can do, as long as I'm on the same sample, so you'll see A2 is at the top of each plot and it's telling me what it's gated on. What I can do is I can hit the shift key and I can hit that right arrow. And I'm not sure if you noticed, but what you can see is that all the samples are now on B2. So if you look up there, you see they've all changed, okay? And you can make modifications to those gates if you think they need to be moved a hair one way or the other, or whatever you need to do. So for example, here, if we're looking at this live cell gate, I might want to push this in a little bit. And what I want you to focus on is this B2 right here. And you see live cells is bold, single cells. They're all the gating here is in bold rather. And if I take this and I move this over, what happens? Okay, I'm able to move this over. I'm having a more restrictive viability gating. And then here, it's still there, but what you see is it's no longer bold, okay? It's still a part of the parent group. It's still part of all samples, but it's a little bit different. So that's FlowJo's way of telling you, okay, the gating is not exactly the same as all the rest of the samples. If I want it to be back to how it was before, and I want it to be the same as the original, if I click delete on my keyboard, are you sure you want to delete it? Yes. Ooh. That usually doesn't happen. It might have been a little bit of a bug. But what winds up happening there is it actually moves it back to where it was. It doesn't delete the gate. That's the most important thing. It's that it just moves it back to where it was before. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just open those back up so I can adjust those gates again and just make sure everything's okay for the rest of them. Okay, and now we're all on B2. Okay, so I'm going to just shift this over a little bit and I'm going to check all of my gates. Okay, maybe a little bit tighter here on the scatter gate. Okay, and when you're doing titration, what's going to be important is that the populations are going to shift, because remember, your antibody concentration is changing. So you don't leave that positive and negative gate exactly where it was for the unstained population, which was, remember, if I hit shift and go over A2, okay? So when I go to B2 and then I go to C2, what you're going to see, it's going to be slightly different, okay? And I could modify that a little bit and see, okay? So B2, C2, okay, now I go to D2, I can make any of those changes. I'm not gonna focus on that so much right now because I think the gating will likely be okay. It's more that you understand that we can check the gating this way, okay? Okay, E2, you see the populations are starting to shift a little bit and we can move this over. But the other thing that you're going to notice as I go along is the population percentages should be somewhat similar, right? You're changing the antibody concentration. You're not changing the percentage of cells in your sample that's expressing that marker, okay? So as I go along, what you're going to see is the negative is going to start being very close to the positive, and it might be a little bit harder to pull it out, but we're adjusting that gate. Okay, that's the whole point of doing that titration. And then once we get here, when we get to that low concentration, it's getting even harder to pull out the positive and the negative. So we do the best that we can here, but that is going to be a little bit difficult. And that was the lowest concentration, okay? So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to check all of those samples. And what you're going to see, if I go a little bit quicker, is you're going to see that population of positive cells shifting down, okay? The percentage is actually staying somewhat similar, around 70% or so, but the signal itself is shifting for the negative and the positive. Okay. So now we know how to make those gates. We know how to apply them to all the samples. We know how to make adjustments to those without deleting it. And at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and X out of all of this because it's a lot. And again, I like things to be nice and clean. So once I know I don't need to make any more changes to those gates, okay, I can X them out, all right? And at this point, what I need to do is I need to do a couple of things. I need to look at the statistics to be able to really identify what concentration or which sample has the concentration that I'm interested in that's going to be the best for me. In order for us to do that, what I want to do is I want to reference back to one of those websites I mentioned earlier in the slides. So I'm going to go to a new window and I'm going to go to our FCCF.MSKCC.org website. And I want you guys to reference this whenever you can. Again, we're always going to be adding content. And one of the things that we have under protocols on our website are good flow notes, okay? So if I click on that, one of the good flow notes that we have is calculating separation index. And when I click on that, it's going to open up to this calculating separation index document and a good flow notes, okay? This is going to walk you through how to calculate the separation index in FlowJo version 10, okay? So I'm not going to go over the document itself in too much detail since we're going to be going over it ourselves. But what we're going to do is we're first going to gate on the positive and negative, which we already did, and then we need to add statistics. So this is where we get into the fun of statistics in FlowJo, okay? What we're going to add
Kathy,
is, oh, yeah.
Can I just interrupt just to remind everyone that you can ask questions in the chat if you have any.
Yes, absolutely. Are there any, is anyone unclear about what I've done so far? Everyone's okay so far? Okay. If Rui's not saying anything, then I'm assuming all is okay so far, and I'll continue.
Yes.
Feel free to stop me if not. Okay, so we're going to gate on the positive negative population like we already did, and then we need to add these statistics. MFI the positive, MFI the negative, and then the 84th percentile the negative. So I'm going to move this over a little bit, and then we're going to come here, and we're going to start adding some statistics, okay? So if I kind of expand out on this workspace, what I can do, if I click on the B220 negative, one of the first things that we wanted to do is add the MFI, okay? So if I come to workspace and I come to this workspace tab right here, you have the option to add a statistic. So if I click on that, you can either go to median and add it directly from here, or what you can do is you can go to add statistic, okay? I prefer this option for what we're about to do. So when I click on add statistic and we're on the B220 negative, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna click at the median, and the parameter that we're looking at, if you remember, was this BV563 or FL19 area. So I'm gonna add that median and it pops up on that sample, okay? Then what I'm gonna do, if I look back at this document, I need the 84th percentile of the negative. So I'm gonna click on percentile, and here, it's on B220 negative already, and we're on that same parameter, so I'm gonna go ahead and click 84 and add that as well. The last thing I need to do is I need to add the MFI of the positive. So if I click on the B220 positive, go back to median, and I also come here and look at the B220 positive, I can add it all from one window, okay? So now I've added the statistics for those specific gates that we have, okay? So I'm gonna go ahead and close that up now, and in the table editor, we're gonna drag in the statistics that we just created. So the table editor is right up here, and when I click on that, it opens up the table editor, like I just mentioned, okay? And we're gonna drag in those statistics. So if I click the control key or command key, I'm gonna go ahead and drag those in, and I'm gonna have all those statistics, okay? From there, in order to go ahead and put the formula in to calculate the separation index, I'm gonna go to edit, I'm gonna add a column, and we're gonna choose formula. Remember, if I'm going a little bit fast, all of these steps are in this document that I'm hovering over right now, okay? We've put on this document a nice and easy formula reference that you can then paste into FlowJo. So if I come here, what I'll do is I'll copy this right there. I'm gonna come back into FlowJo and I'm gonna paste it. Oops. It will let me. There we go, okay. And then what we found the easiest was to tell people that what you wanna do is, in order to replace those little brackets where it says insert reference MFI positive, we highlighted anything that needed to be replaced with the statistic in red, okay? So you'll see anything in red that's there, right there, says insert reference MFI positive. I've highlighted that here, and now I'm gonna come to insert reference, very straightforward, and from the positive, we're gonna insert the MFI, okay? Then insert reference MFI negative. If I highlight that, we're gonna do the same thing, okay? So this is all super straightforward, okay? MFI of the negative, not percentile, so I wanna make sure I hit there, okay? And then I have two more. I need to insert the 84th percentile of the negative. So that's the percentile that I created, okay? And then you'll notice there's still this error right here. It's saying there's an unknown command. That typically is because you haven't filled everything in. So I need to go ahead and do that MFI of the negative still, because that's just our little reference. It's not a true statistic, okay? Once I do that, now what we're seeing is there's no errors, everything is okay. And I can change the column heading to title that separation index, okay? And I can go ahead and hit okay there. And then we have our formula. Now you're not seeing anything, right? So you might say, all right, great, why does that matter to me? What we still have to do is we have to create the table. So if I come back to the table editor at this point, there are a couple of different options. You can create the table to display. You can do it also to a file, which can be CSV, Excel, text, anything like that, or you can do it to the layout, okay? What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do it to current layout to show you, because I'm gonna bring in the actual files themselves after and the dot plots so that we can actually see what we're looking at and why it's, how it matches up. Okay, so then in order to create the table, I'm going to click it right there. And what we're going to see is the layout editor opens up in FlowJo. And we're going to see specific to each well what the separation index is. Okay, so if you remember from before, what happened was A2 is our completely unstained. So that one's actually irrelevant. We don't care about that one. I could have deleted that FCS file if I really wanted to. But what we saw was H2 was the lowest dilution and it kept going up to B2. I don't have the values, but we can assume it went from about 10 micrograms per mil at B2, 5, 2.5, 1.25, and it continually went down. Okay. Now, what we're seeing here, we want the separation index to be at its highest. And typically what you'll see when we're titrating is that it's going to hit a point where it's increasing, and then it goes down because your negative starts shifting up. Okay. So the data is great. We want to look at the statistics, but how do you visualize that? One thing that many people ask to see is data overlays. So I'm going to first show you how to do the data overlays of that, of the histograms of all of those files. And then I'm also going to go ahead and I'm going to show you how to do concatenation so that we can visualize it all together. Okay, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to change the zooming a little bit so that we can see this a little bit better. And I'm going to show you how to do some data overlays. Okay, and I'm going to X out of this table editor. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is I want to bring in our live single cells into the layout editor. So if I bring in this scatter gate, which has been pre-gated on all of that, what I see here is I see the fluorescent parameter versus side scatter, okay? If I want to change that to histogram, I can simply double click on it and change it from pseudo color to histogram. And the x-axis is going to remain on that BV563, or I can change it to whatever parameter I want. Okay? So I'm going to leave it there on the BV563, and I'm going to hit OK. From there, what I can do, if I come in, I can actually select the equivalent nodes for all of the rest of the samples. And you can do that by coming to workspace, or edit rather, and selecting equivalent nodes. Or what you can do is, I think it's Command or Control Shift E. I'm on a Mac right now, so it's a little bit different. You could also right click on that scatter population and you can select equivalent nodes there. But I'm just going to do it here because this mouse is a little bit tricky. And again, I'm on a different computer. So I'm going to edit, select equivalent nodes. And now all of my samples are highlighted on scatter. I'm going to deselect that A2 because I already have that here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take, I'm going to take all of those samples that I had and I'm going to drag them all in. So all I did was I made sure that I had all of those highlighted and I dragged all of those samples in. Okay, now this is a little bit small. So if I want to take a look at this in a bigger way so we can actually all see it, I'm going to adjust the scaling to be about 200 or maybe about 150. Okay. So here we see all of the individual FCS files overlaid into one. If I double click on that, one thing that I typically like to do is normalize that data, right? So for the y-axis, what I'll do is I'll change it from automatic scaling to modal. And when we apply that, you'll see it normalizes the data, okay? And it's normalized to the mode. So that's one of the first things that I like to do. Another thing is when you're looking at this, it might be a little bit difficult to actually see that all of these individual FCS files, they're right on top of each other. So what I want to do is I want to pull them out while also looking at the overlay. Sorry. So if I right click there, what we can do is we can actually hover down and take a look at the histogram option. If I right click on that plot, and I can change it to half offset, okay? When I do that, what am I able to see? I'm able to see my negative, the A2, and I'm able to see the highest dilution or the lowest dilution going up to the highest, okay? And I'm actually able to see it a little bit cleaner now. And you're able to also see how the negative starts shifting up. And that's what you would expect as you go beyond saturation as you're titrating. Now, if this were me, and this was my data, what I'd like to do is I'd actually like to move the completely unstained sample up so it matches, it's right below, or right above rather, the lowest concentration. So if I take that, all I simply have to do is click and drag that sample and bring it all the way up, and then you're able to really see this dilution series, okay? Other things that you can do, you can right click, you can change the coloring, and you can have it not tinted. You can right click, you can change so it's partially tinted, you can change the line weight, you can change the coloring by, oops, you can change the coloring when you click here, right, where each individual sample is. So if you wanted that to be black, it changes it to black. There's a lot of different options there, okay? The other thing that you can do if you go down to histograms is there's offset, half offset, stagger. There's all these different options for you to play around with as you're doing data overlays, okay? So I just want you to know and be aware of that, okay? But what I would typically tend to do is something like this, and I would modify the coloring a little bit so that it made a little bit more sense, okay? But you now have all the tools to do that. And the last thing I want to go over with this data set for titration before we go ahead and go into compensation is how to concatenate the files to look at them all together, okay? So I'm going to minimize this layout editor for now. I'm going to actually also close out of our website because we don't need it for now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to concatenate all of those titrations together. For the purposes of this, I don't need to concatenate the unstained because I don't have that preference right now. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to select the scatter again. I'm going to select equivalent nodes. I'm going to deselect A2. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to choose to concatenate, okay? So if I go ahead to the File tab and I choose Export or Concatenate, we can export and concatenate those populations, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and choose that option. I'm going to hit Concatenate, and what that does is that's going to bring all of those FCS files from that are gated on scatter and live cells and single cells, and it's going to combine them into one FCS file, okay? I'm going to change or make sure the destination is within the titration data folder, which is where all the other files are. So I'm going to leave it there. And when I go to advanced options, we can change the name of it. So I'm going to say 327 or 0327 training. And I'm going to leave all the other options. You don't need to change anything. And I'm going to hit concatenate. Once it does that, I'm going to hit, I want it in the existing workspace, and I'm going to close. By hitting existing workspace, what's going to happen is this is now going to come into that workspace, okay? And when I click on this now, what you'll see is it's concatenated the events that were within those gates from each sample. And now what I can do is I can come down here on the x-axis, I can choose sample ID. And here on the y-axis, I can choose that parameter I was titrating. Typically, when you're working with DIVA data, it'll automatically pull out well resolved, but here on the Cytoflex, you just need to adjust the transform and customize it and do what we did before, where we're just bringing that value down. So if I change that to 1 million, say, you can start seeing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I believe, okay? The other option is just to go ahead and use this minus key and get all of your samples right on scale. And when I hit apply there, what do we see? We see our lowest titration going up to our highest titration. And what we'd want to do is we'd want to reference back to those statistics that we created and not just rely on a visual analysis to be able to pull out which concentration that we wanted to use. Now, just a quick side note before we move on from this titration data set, I want to make sure that you understand that just because it's at saturation, that does not mean that that's necessarily the concentration that you might want to use. You also have to take into account the spillover and the spread between multiple channels, your panel, the expression of the marker in and of itself. There are multiple things that go into picking which concentration that you want to use, and it's not strictly based on this, but this is how you would calculate it for individual markers. So it's just an important note there. Okay. Now, I'm going to go ahead, unless Rui stops me with any questions, and I'm going to go ahead and create a new workspace that we can review titration. Okay. And also to save, this is a good point. So you can save your workspace by clicking save or save as. We can save it as a template. Okay. And I could always save that if we want to come back to it later. Okay. Desktop. Titration data, and I'll just leave it as the date. Okay. Save changes, and I'm going to go ahead and do new. Okay. So one of the things that multiple people brought up was using or calculating compensation in FlowJo. That does come up quite often, so I'm going to show you how to go ahead and do that. You might hear a puppy in the background. I apologize for that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in this multicolor folder right here, and I'm just going to drag it in the same way. And what you'll see here is that you have the two folders, right? You have multicolor, which is the name of the folder in and of itself, and then you also have compensation, okay? When I look at compensation and I look at multicolor, you're going to notice that only the samples that have compensation control were dragged into this group. Okay, and once I click on that, what you'll also see is you'll see the option to go ahead and compensate, where if I click on all samples, that's grayed out. Okay, the last thing that you'll see before I go ahead and start showing you the compensation is that if you see where my mouse is, there's compensation matrix that's been applied, and it was from the acquisition for these 4 samples, whereas for these, there is no compensation applied. Okay. So I'm going to go to compensation, and then we're going to get that started. And I know these are extenuating circumstances, so I apologize. I do have to let a dog out really quickly because I'm the only one in the house. Give me 2 seconds. Because if not, you would have heard her scratching for a while, and that would have distracted everyone. So I apologize. And thank you. So when I go ahead and I do this compensation, what do we see? We see that there are quite a few single colors here. And if I scroll down, they're all matching up, and they're all giving me this nice little green symbol, which is saying that everything's okay and you're good to go ahead. But because I'm a cytometrist, I always have to question and say, is this data actually correct if I'm looking at the compensation? Does this make sense? And one of the first things that I hope that all of you recognize, that I recognized when I first looked at this data set, is that it's taking a look at 2 things. We're looking at beads, but our unstained control is cells, okay? So that's not gonna work out for us, all right? We need to make sure that when we're looking at beads for compensation, that the autofluorescence that we're referencing back to is also beads, and the same goes for cells. So one of the first things that I want to do with this data set is I want to make sure that I'm gating around the correct population for my positive and negative, okay? So this APC, for example, what you'll see is that the compensation control for APC, which is sample 007, is beads. It's very clearly defined by scatter there that you see that. And the unstained control is very clearly cells, okay? So what I'm gonna do, as opposed to the negative being the unstained control, I'm going to double click on this plot right here, and I'm gonna draw a gate around the negative APC, okay? I'm gonna hit okay there. And when I do that, I'm now going to change this negative so that it's that APC subset. And now what do we see? We don't see those cells anymore because we don't need a negative cell reference for beads. That's very, very important. And I think that comes up quite often sometimes when people are asking, why does my compensation look off? You know, it's come up on the Purdue list recently. Make sure that if you're looking at beads or cells that you're referencing the correct negative. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to quickly adjust and put around a negative gate for each of these ones that are bead controls. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click on that. I'm going to choose this interval gate, put it around the negative, and I'm also giving a quick check to make sure that the positive is around encompasses all of the bright peak. Okay, and I'm going to make sure I change the negative for each one. Okay. Be a little bit quiet as I do that. This way I can focus and get it done a little quicker. Now here what we're seeing is actually something a little bit different. This AmCyan, which is their viability control, is cells, okay? So we actually do want to reference the unstained control of cells here. The only thing that I want to do though is I kind of want to change the scatter gating, because this scatter gating might not be the best, and this sample is a little bit messy. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to double click on that, and when I do that, I can now adjust the scatter gating for this sample. And you can take each node and kind of drag it out and make sure it's around a majority of the cells. Okay, not all cells are cell lines. This is just a tissue sample that was a little bit dirtier, so that's why it looks like that. Not all cells and samples are created equal. Okay, so then I can close out of that, and here for the positive gate, I'm going to double click, and I'm going to really make sure I'm around the brightest part of the positive, and that will give us the best compensation. Okay, X out there, and then for the unstained, I'm going to double click there, and I'm just going to try and match up that scatter gating as best I can to ensure that I'm looking at the true autofluorescence of those cells and not the debris in the background and all of that stuff. So these gates are now pretty similar, so I feel somewhat confident. Our percentages are similar. I don't have to get too crazy with it, but I'm just making sure that referencing the correct negative. Okay, going back to beads, I'm going to go ahead and put the negative gates in. And what you'll notice now, again, is I'm looking at the subsets of the negative population of the beads for all of these, with the exception of the AmCyan, which actually was cells, okay? Now here, going along, almost through. Thank you guys for bearing with me as I adjust all of these, but it's to show you guys what you'd actually be seeing with your data, okay? Now here, PE size 7, one of the first things that I see if I double click, all right, well, the voltages weren't set correctly. It's off scale. This isn't great. But when I actually look a little bit closer, what I notice here on the forward scatter and side scatter is, as good as FlowJo is, it really didn't find that population of beads. It honed in on this aggregate of beads right here that was only 1.42%. So what I want to do is I want to click on that, and I want to drag it down and bring these nodes down, okay? Once I do that, sometimes it can be a little bit tricky. It's now 89%. That's a lot better than 1%, and those are our true beads. So always be mindful and look at those things as you're going through. Okay, so I'm going to X that out, and now I'm going to double click back here, because what I'm going to notice is that this gating on the positive isn't there. And if I look back up at this sample for PE size 7, it's now giving me a red warning because it's saying it doesn't have enough events. That's because you need to go in and modify it and put it around the true positive for the real bead population. So I'm going to double click. I'm going to come here. I'm going to adjust this. And then I'm going to put it around the negative. Okay. So then when I do that, we've lost that warning because we have enough events, and we can grade the correct subset. Okay. Very quickly, I'm just going to do these last two, and then we're going to calculate the compensation. Okay. There's also the option as you do all of these, if you do them individually, you can then go back and change the subsets after. So I'm going to do that for sake of time. This way we have a chance to go over batch exports and everything like that. Okay. I'm going to click here, subset, subset, subset. I like checking things. I think everyone should. So we're going to go through and we're going to double check all of these. These are our cells. And now we're good. Okay. So at this point, what we can do, if you want, you can rename the compensation matrix. So I could say Kathy, oops, 327. Can everyone hear that dog, or is that just me? Okay. You can then view the matrix, or you can apply it to the whole group. Okay. So if I go then to view the matrix, it's now going to show me the compensation matrix that I had just applied. Okay. And when we're in FlowJo, what you'll see is the teal is the uncompensated and the black is the compensated. And you can look at individual samples to see how well it was compensated. So if I click here and I go from preview sample, I can actually change it so that we're looking at one of your true samples with that compensation matrix that I had just recalculated, okay? So if I come down there and I'm looking at one of the spleen samples, we can see that there, if I unclick overlay compensated, I'm just looking at the compensated data here, and everything's looking pretty clean and pretty nice, okay? So this looks great. And I'm happy with this. And if I now want to bring this to all of my samples, right, what I can do is I can drag this M over to all samples, and that's going to bring the matrix and apply it to all the samples that I have in my workspace, okay? You also have the option to save the compensation matrix, and you can store it as a CSV file, or you could also store it as a FlowJo compensation matrix file, okay? By clicking on Save Matrix, you have both of those options, okay? One little tip though, just be careful, because if you're not looking at your viable cells, sometimes the compensation may look a little bit off. Don't forget that dead cells actually bind non-specifically to antibodies. So you might have some bizarre staining patterns that you might not be certain of why they're happening, and it might just be because you need to gate on live cells and look at live cell populations to check your compensation. And another good little flow tip, always make sure that you use FC block as well, because if you don't use the FC block, you might have weird staining populations as well, okay? So that's a quick overview of compensation, okay? And one of the last things that I want to go over, because we're hitting at about 2 o'clock now, but as long as I'm keeping everybody and everyone's here, I want to go over creating a gating strategy in the layout editor and creating a batch report in FlowJo, okay? So I'm going to close out of that.
Kathy,
Yes.
can I just interrupt to ask you a question? So there's a question from Carlo where he says, do you recommend changing the values in the compensation matrix if something looks not good enough?
Okay, that's a great question. That's something that comes up quite often in Flow, and I should have brought that up. So what can wind up happening, sometimes people might come in and they might want to edit, right? And it'll create a new matrix. What's going to happen there is, if you look at this, this is a, what is it, a 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 color experiment, I believe. You have to be very mindful that when you change one value, within this whole n by n plot, populations are shifting that you might not even be looking at or aware of. So I would highly discourage manually adjusting any of these values, okay? The only circumstance which I would say it might be acceptable is if it's maybe a 2 or 3 color and you're looking at statistics. So what compensation is doing is it's actually going ahead and it's matching the MFI of the positive and the negative of the spillover channel, right? So if you had APC size 7 and APC, for example, or Alexa 700, what's happening is if it's an Alexa 700 single color, it's making sure that that spillover into APC size 7 is corrected so that the MFI is matching between the two. So if I go ahead and I just change a value and change it to 0, what you might notice as I change that from about 120 to 0, I want you to look here, right? So it's not just these two that are having the change. And as I make that change, this of course is not going to be compensated, but look at the impact of PE size 7 and APC. Look at the impact of all these other detectors that we weren't even caring about, right? Things change across the board. So this is my very long-winded way of saying, please don't do it. Please make sure that your single colors are as bright or brighter than your samples to make sure that you can actually carry out correct compensation. And the last thing that I'll mention is for the first run of an experiment, I know it's a little bit more time consuming, but if you can bring single colors that are beads and single colors that are cells, it will enable you to make sure with your first run that you can ensure that your positive is as bright or brighter and that there's no differences between the beads versus cells. So it's one extra step that we recommend the first run of the experiment. And then once you make sure everything's good, then you shouldn't have to manually adjust, because that should not be something that's done. That's my long-winded response to that short question. Any more questions on comp, or are we good to go over just a quick batch analysis and layout editor?
We're good to go.
Okay, great. All right, so I'm gonna then save this, right? So I'm gonna save that because this is our multicolor. I'm gonna go compensation.
Oh, sorry, I just saw another question here. Somebody saying also, what are your thoughts on saving compensation and reusing it for future experiments?
Okay, that's another great question. So if I understand the question correctly, you're saying, all right, I ran my 20 color experiment on March 27th, 2020. And on April 27th, 2020, I have the same exact experiment to run. And can I just reuse those single colors? The answer I would have is no. You have to run the single colors each time. The reason for that is the instrument is kind of like me, right? I wake up one day, I'm not exactly the same as I am the next day. The instrument is going to have slight changes, whether it's laser delay, whether it's signal intensity. There's a range that can be in that's accepted as normal for QC, whether you're utilizing a core facility and they're running CS&T beads or QC beads specific to the instrument, whether they're multi-peak, whatever they are. But there are going to be slight changes, and usually if they're in a certain range, we deem it acceptable, whether it's CVs or voltage changes or gain changes, whatever it is. But those changes could have impacts on your experiment. So that's from the instrument side, and why I would suggest always bringing single colors. But from the experimental standpoint, you have to be very cautious because there can be changes in your actual fluorochromes and your lot of antibody from March 27th to April 27th, right? You might see it change so that your tandem starts to degrade, or you might see a little bit of signal intensity loss, or what if your cells start to overexpress and then you're having a higher level of expression? So there are way too many variables for us to be able to just say, let's just run the same sample, let's just use the same samples and tweak, because that is, in my opinion, manipulation of data. And I would never put my name on data that does that. And I highly encourage everyone to think about the implications of reusing compensation. Okay, many more? Okay.
Sorry, yeah, there's another one here. Okay. Which is best, to do the comp after the run or during the run?
You know, you might want to, that's a personal preference, honestly. If it's the first run, I would suggest doing the compensation before, just to make sure everything went smoothly, right? Because then you know, oh, I have to remake this single color, or I have to redo this, like, right? If your sample is actually brighter, or whatever it is, you have a quick way to check so that it's not 2 days later, you're analyzing your data and you're like, oh man, you know, all of my samples are actually brighter. I had the opportunity then to remake single colors, now I don't. So what I would suggest is, at least for the first run, do it before you start. And then for subsequent runs, you might be able to be a little bit more lax, but it's going to depend on your experiment.
Mm-hmm. I have a few questions coming in. One of them again from Carlo. So he's asking, when selecting the populations on the histograms for positives and negatives, how much of the peak should you select? And how does that affect the compensation calculation by FlowJo?
So when you're looking at that, it is a very good question. What you want to take into account, if I go back into this comp matrix, if I click here and I shift this over, what's going to wind up happening, if I have too few events, you're not going to be able to calculate compensation. I forget the specific number, if I'm being honest, of how many it needs. It needs at least a couple of hundred. I'm not sure if it's 300 to 500, but statistically, the more you have, the better, right? So that's why when you're at the instrument, whatever it is, as opposed to just running 5,000 events, try running 10,000 maybe, or 20,000, and especially be careful if it sells. Okay? But then as far as what portion of the population it is, if you're around the brightest part, it is okay. Typically with beads, it's so uniform, you might up being fine just having that gate around the whole of the population. And then I keep it around the whole of the negative as well. But if you have the positive that's, you know, around the brightest part, as long as you have enough events, that should be sufficient. Okay. And as you're getting the next question, let me let this dog in so that it doesn't distract anymore.
Yeah, I actually I should make here a very good point that that Carla Moncada is making.
Mhm.
You know, she's talking about the you know, how to get good compensation controls, and she mentions here titration should help make sure you have good samples. And when running a multi-parameter experiment, optimization by titrating and using FMO controls is the key to producing the you know, the best compensation controls. And I think that's a very important aspect of you know, people are always trying to tweak things at the end
Yeah.
rather than actually thinking of their, you know, a good experimental planning, and that's doing titration and preparing your FMO control to troubleshoot your multi panel design, sorry, your multi-panel, and then running these things and making sure that they're all working properly. Once you know that's working properly, then yes, you can be almost sure that you're going to get a very good compensation controls.
Absolutely. Controls are critical. Flow is no different than anything else. We really want to make sure as much as possible that we're accounting for all the variables and controlling the experiment as much as possible. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. There's also a question from Paul. He's asking, does it matter if the compensation values are negative?
Does it matter if the compensation values are negative? What I would suggest I don't typically see negative compensation values all that much. Honestly, I don't have a lot of experience with that. What I would always suggest to do if you're running into a circumstance where you're not really sure, right? And you want to just check your comp, as opposed to looking at the values themselves, what I want you to do is look at the data itself, right? So if I double click and I take a look, this is obviously bad, right? You can tell when I changed that value to 0, everything looked terrible. When I did the compensation correctly and I looked at a sample, everything looked okay. But it might be hard to tell with the values themselves. So I wouldn't focus on that so much. And I'm not very educated on negative value compensation. But what I would suggest doing, if it's for you to see in this n by n plot, what you can do is you can kind of create your own n by n plot where you're seeing all the parameters together in an easier way, and just do a quick visual inspection.
Yeah, so I should add there, right, I would add there that, so if you're seeing negative values, it can be two issues. One of them is not an issue, it's just the values are very close to 0, but there is always an error in compensation. So you know, they may be very close to 0, but positive or negative. Yeah. And so that's not an issue at all. That's fine. The other thing that Kathy was mentioning is, well, if you have problems with your compensation controls, if you're not following those 3 golden rules of compensation controls, then you might see something that's overcompensated and you get negative values. And that means you need to, you know, check your compensation controls again. Yeah. So you shouldn't have negative values unless they're very close to 0.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think that's, oh, okay, this is a very interesting question. It might be, it might take us a lot of discussion here, but the question is, what are the best compensation, beads or cells? And does high expression of antigen change the compensation? Yeah. So I don't know if you want to address this now, or we can address it at another another class.
So I think what we can do is I'd like to show people, as long as everyone's on board, because I think that we still have everyone. I'd really like to go over the basics of, you know, creating the gating strategy and doing batch reports and all of that, because a couple of people had asked for that. And once we wrap that up, even in this discussion for this part of the talk or this session on the 27th, anyone that wants to stick around for that, we can have an in-depth discussion on that and what we've seen at MSK in our facility, at our core facility. But for now, I think we should kind of table that till the end to make sure that for the rest of the people, we get their questions answered. Does that sound good?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Wonderful. So I'll change this out, but that is an awesome question. And we're actually, I think Rui and myself are both excited to talk about that. So we're looking forward to when we get to it.
Right.
Okay, so I'm closing out of the compensation, and this basic tutorial data set is actually from FlowJo. So I encourage you to go to the FlowJo website and look at their tutorials, because they actually give you this data set. So I'm gonna then use that to help you guys and look at some basic gating strategies. Okay, so if I bring this in, oops. We can see the data is already compensated. I'm not going to go over the compensation again because we just went over that. And they actually don't have single colors for this anyway. So even if we wanted to, we couldn't. And I'm going to do a very quick gating based on what we talked about earlier. Okay, so if I double click, this is now how you see data. And again, the last one also was from BD. So if I double click on this little circle, again, what we're able to see is it's from an LSR2 if I look at this $CYT, okay? And also what you'll see in the properties that I didn't go over before, it's a little bit rudimentary, but what you see if I kind of scroll along, it gives you the stability of the signal over time for those individual detectors. So it's a nice way to be able to go through and check to see how your sample ran, to see if any clogs potentially came up or anything like that as you're going through, if any of that signal had jumped or anything like that. There are plugins that you can use that are a bit better for this. We're not going to be talking about that today, but just that you know that it's there. Okay. All right, so we're going to first look at the dead cell gating, because now we all know that that's my preference. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a polygon. And I'm going to look at the live cells first. Okay, I'm going to name that live cells. Okay, and then again, what I mentioned before to you is that we can go ahead and we can make that specific to the group, and it doesn't necessarily have to go up to all samples, right? So you have that option. Okay, I'm going to double click on that. And we're going to do forward scatter area and forward scatter height. And this is a nice, really clear differentiation between aggregates and single cells, okay? And for this sample, this tutorial data set, they only have the option to look at height versus area and forward scatter because they didn't enable it on the instrument any other way. So this is what we're forced to look at, but it pulls out really nicely. Okay. So we're going to look at our single cells again. We can only do one single cell gate here. And then I'm going to look at forward and side scatter. And I'm going to hone in with the polygon or the rectangular gate, or sorry, elliptical gate on these cells right here. Okay. So now, again, like I taught you a little bit earlier, we're going to drag these up under the live cell population. And be mindful, because if you were to drag that up just to the tutorial data, it's going to create a separate gate that's not underneath those parent gates. So be mindful when you're setting those gates and where you're putting those gates, because if you drag it over a certain population, it will then become a child of that parent gate. But if you drag it up to the whole group, it's going to be independent. So just make sure that you're very careful about that. So I'm going to delete that because I don't need it, and I'm going to delete it entirely. I just wanted to show you the importance of dragging a population under the parent. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hit that shift key, and I'm going to do a quick check of all my gating. This might be able to be brought in a little bit. I'm not going to get too crazy with it. It's just showing you the basics, but if I were really doing a deeper analysis, I'd go back to the unstained, which unfortunately I don't have here, and I might bring that in a little bit and make it a little bit cleaner, because those might be some dead or dying cells. Okay. Then from there, from your single cells, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to double click, and I'm just going to show you a very basic CD3, CD4, CD8, okay? So if I look at CD3, you can look at it versus another marker, you can look at it versus forward scatter, side scatter. Here we're able to pull it out pretty clean versus forward scatter, so I'm going to do a rectangular gate, and I'm going to call those my CD3 positive cells, okay? Oops. What you will notice, see, I did this on purpose. I actually accidentally put that under the single cells and not under the scatter gate population. So what I can do is I can drag that under here and make sure I delete the gate that I actually didn't need, right? I didn't need it under single cells. I wanted to make sure that that was actually underneath the parent, okay? So then if I change this to CD3 and do forward scatter, the gate will then appear again. because I don't want it under single cells. I want it under the scatter cells. Okay, so then I'm going to bring that up to all of the rest of my cells. Okay, I can quickly check there. You can make any modifications that you need to. So if this needs to come over a little bit, that's okay. As the individual who brought up the question earlier said, or the statement earlier, controls are important. So when you're setting gates, setting them based off of unstained or FMO is going to be an important thing, especially as you're starting to do more multicolor. But since this is basic, we're not getting too crazy into that today. Okay, then I'll double click there. And the last thing that we're gonna look at is CD4 and CD8. Okay, and we have a nice population pulling out for both. And what winds up happening sometimes that I want to go over with you is that sometimes it might not look so pretty, and you might have the scaling might be a little bit different. So for example, if I hit this transform button and I go to customize the axis, what you might see is something like this. It's typically it defaults to about -100. Okay, so for anyone that's seen that, when you're like, why is my data all scrunched up? It's just it's the width basis, right? It's the visualization of the negative and how it's scaling. So really all that you need to do when you see this is hit the transform button, and you can customize the axis like we did before with our Cytoflex data and adjust that width basis, okay? With the new version of FlowJo, there's the option for positive decades as well. I have to be honest that I'm pretty used to using the width basis to adjust that scaling. I don't have too much experience with the positive decades, so I typically tend to just adjust this width basis. There are going to be some new things with the newer versions, but for the most part, when you're looking at that negative space, I just want you to play around with the width basis and make sure that we're really visualizing our data so that we're not seeing too much white space and we're able to resolve those populations. Okay, I'm going to be a little bit lazy, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to put in a rectangular gate just to show you what I'm trying to do, as opposed to doing a polygon and drawing all the nodes. So I'm going to do the CD8 cells. Okay, and then I'm going to look at the CD4 cells. Okay.
Kathy, can I ask you a question here that somebody's placing here? Somebody's asking that they often have issues with deleting gating when they're part of a group analysis. I think you showed that earlier. And so the question is, you copy gates to all samples, but then want to delete one in 1 or 2 samples. I haven't figured out this part of FlowJo. Can you do this individually? How to unlink?
So you're going to have you're not going to be able to delete a gate if it's part of a group and you've applied that gate to the whole entire group, right? So what you're not going to be able to do, if I wanted to delete this, you can't delete that because it's owned by the group itself. So you'd actually have to go ahead and put that sample in a different group if you wanted to delete, because what you'd have to do is delete this gate for the whole entire group and then put it in individually and not have it owned by the group. That's my understanding, and I haven't seen any circumstance where you can delete a gate owned by a group specific to a sample in that group. I don't think that's an option. But then if you wanted to go ahead, and if anyone can correct me on that, if I'm wrong about that, please let me know. That's something I have not seen before, but I'd be very happy if anyone could correct me on that. And then for—
I think you answered the question, yes.
Okay, I just want to make sure. Because again, there might be certain things that other people might be able to teach me and teach everyone else that I'd be very happy to share with everyone else. Okay, so then the CD4, CD8, if we go ahead and highlight those and then bring them under, now it's a part of all these samples, right? All these FCS files have it. As opposed to checking each and every one and taking a little bit more time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to assume everything's okay and that I've checked it, and I'm going to show you how to do the batch gating, okay, or the batch processing. Okay. So if we go ahead and we go onto the layout editor, which is right here, I'm going to click on that, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in the FCS file without any gating. When I do that, what winds up happening is you're going to see a completely ungated population. if I had went ahead and if I had actually looked and double checked the gating for all of those, it should have popped up with the gates I was looking for, with the viability versus forward scatter and all of that. But if you bring it in and you haven't checked it, it's going to default to other detector or parameters by default, usually forward scatter, side scatter. So I'm going to try seeing if I forget the first one that I did, but let me see. I think, for example, this one. Oh, nope. Sometimes it's a little buggy, so it did not work for that one. But what I can do is I can double check on that. And this is a good example for what to do in case something like this happens. So when I double click on that plot, when I go to specify, I can change the type from a histogram to pseudo color or whatever you'd like to do, right? So, and they can do dead versus forward scatter. And if I hit apply, then you start seeing the gates. But what was lost and what will happen sometimes, because it is a software tool, it does get a little bit buggy from time to time, like any other one will. It lost the annotation for the scaling and all of that and the labeling. So if I go to annotate, I don't want it to hide these axes. So I want to show the axes, and I can uncheck where it's saying to hide everything. Okay, so I can actually see it. And then what I'll do, I'll actually adjust this, and I usually like to set my own labels. So on the x-axis, I'll say this is, maybe I'm going to make it up, DAPI liability, whether or not that was it. And then this is forward scatter area, okay? And if I come to fonts, I can go ahead and I can change the labels and what they are and their size and whether they're bold or not. There are all these different options, okay? I'm not going to play around with that now, but just know that you do have that capability. And you can also change between pseudo color, zebra, density, contour, all those different options, okay? I'm gonna hit okay, and then there we are. We see my labels, we see everything else, I see my gate, and what I tend to do is I tend to go ahead and I delete this little option right here, which is giving me the name of the FCS file, how many events, and everything like that. And I'm gonna show you what I do a little bit later on. And next thing I do is I drag in the live cell. And when I do that, this is what you should see, right? We see the next gated population. So under live cells, we have the single cells. Okay. It's a little bit messy right now. I'm going to leave it and show you how to clean it up. I'm going to bring in the single cells, and that's going to show me my cells. Okay. If I bring in the cells, it'll show me my CD3, and then I have one more to bring in, which is my CD3. Okay. Now here in the layout editor, what I've done is I've shown my whole gating strategy. Okay, those little text boxes that I deleted for the one, I'm going to delete it for all of them. And I'm still going to include a label, and I'm just going to show you how I'm going to do that. Okay, so I'm going to go here, and what I prefer, it's everybody's preference. I prefer to drag this out right here, if everyone can see where my mouse is, because I want to look at all of this in one row. So I'm going to adjust this scaling to be at about 66% so I can hopefully see it a little bit better. And I'm going to do everything side by side, okay? If you're a little bit anal like me, what you can do is you can click on all of them, and you can highlight them, arrange, and click top. And this way all of them are arranged at the same starting point, okay? That's just me, but it's a nice little tool that you have, okay? I drag this out, so this is all one page that we're seeing it on. And then the last thing I want to do before I create my batch report so we can see all the samples is I'm going to put in a text box so that we can see what sample we're actually looking at, okay? So if I come right here and I click on this little A, and I click and drag, it's going to give me the option to either manually input whatever you'd like, or you can put in a keyword, okay? So the sample that we're on right now is this CO2 EXP. So if I right click, I can insert a keyword, and as long as I select the correct sample that I'm on, C2 EXP, I'm gonna see all of the keywords for the experiment. Remember I told you a little bit about that earlier when you click on that little circle and you can start seeing some of the information. So if I did $CYT rather, it would bring up LSR2. I'm just gonna quickly tell you a little trick for BD data. If you scroll all the way down to the bottom and you do tube name, it'll give you the tube name that you put in. I prefer this. I think it's a lot cleaner, a lot nicer. So if you put in that keyword and put in tube name, it'll give you specific to that FCS file what you put in. If you're ever confused on what keyword you should use, again, just click there, and when you scroll down, you should be able to find it. So you can see tube name gives you that name. You have well ID, you have all of that, because this looks like it was plate data, right? So you have all these different keywords, and you can always use that to your advantage. Okay. Now, batch reports, okay? So I want this for all of my samples. What I'm gonna do then is I'm gonna go back to Layout Editor, and I wanna create a batch report. And typically what I'll do is I'll do one column down, okay? And I'm gonna create that batch report right here. And you can do it to either a new layout, a printer, web page, PowerPoint, PDF, whatever you'd like. That gives you those options. And if you click on any of those, you'll have to tell it where you want it to go, okay? I'm gonna do it, again, to new layout. And I'm gonna create that batch report. It might take a minute or so. And there you have all of your data. Keep in mind, you can add in statistics to this like we did earlier with the titration. You can put in a whole lot of different things. You can customize this to be whatever you like. There are a lot of options, but sometimes people feel like they need to go ahead and they need to go back to the layout, and they need to change and iterate by sample and check each one, which you also have the ability to do. But you don't have to do that unless you really want to. You can go ahead and create a batch, okay? So that's the easiest way to go ahead and create a batch report. You also can, and for your gating strategy, right? You can also do it specific just for one gate. So if you wanted to just drag this in and have it be your CD4, CD8, you can also have a batch report of just all of these by creating that, okay? So you don't have to do it in any specific way. It's the data that you need. And because we're running a little bit late on time, the last thing I'll show you very quickly before we open it up to general questions is how to look at some backgating, because I think that's a really nice tool, okay? So I'm gonna just double click here and show you. I can change the name of it in case we get confused a little bit later. I get confused, not you guys. If I want to have an idea of if I gated correctly, what I like to do quickly is I like to bring a population in that I'm interested in. So say if I really wanted my CD8 cells, if I drag that in, right, all I'm seeing is my CD8 positive. If I right click, sorry, again, this mouse is not my favorite. What you can do is you can go ahead and you can look at backgating. What backgating is going to do, and I think a lot of people really like this and don't know about it until they're told, it's telling you where are those CD8 cells falling? Did I accidentally gate in an incorrect way, right? So it's telling you it's in the CD3 positive, and there's also some in CD3 negative, right? And it's in mostly my single cells, and it's within mostly my live cells and all of that. But you might run into a scenario where you're seeing you're gating a little too stringent and you're not seeing the population that you're looking for, or not enough events. And it might just be because your gating is a little bit off. And this is a really, really helpful tool for you to be able to go in and take a look and say, all right, where are all of those cells that I'm interested in as my final population falling throughout all of the rest of these gates? I find that to be super helpful. So that's backgating. If you do ancestry, it's going to show you, similar to the gating I just showed you, the whole parental gating strategy that you had. Okay, so you have those two options. All right. There are a whole host of other tools available in FlowJo, whether it's adjunct histograms, overlays, like where we went over overlays. There's more biology specific things, proliferation and cell cycle, that we plan on going over in future sessions that might be a little bit more advanced, or some more multi-parameter stuff with t-SNE and all of that. The purposes of today were to go over some basics of FlowJo that I think we accomplished today. And I think we went over everything we were hoping to. But now I think is a good time to see if anyone has any questions and anything specific that maybe I can go over, or Rui as well. And also thank you to everyone for joining us as well.
Thank you, Kathy. I think you know, there are a few questions here from the beginning. Maybe I should have addressed them at the time. I hope people are still here that asked this question. But you know, in the beginning, when you were talking about the adding the files to the software, there's somebody asking. Sometimes names don't transfer from Diva, and you get random file number names in FlowJo. Why is this?
For that, what I would highly suggest doing is going into preferences. That's a great question. Preferences is our friend. And if you go to workspace, the sample display naming might need to be adjusted. So you might have a different set of display names here. And if you come here by the keyword, you can always adjust that, right? So if I wanted to adjust it so it was under tube name, and do any of that, you have the option to play with that here. If you're still having any issues or anything like that, you could always reach out to the side and I can try and help you. But this is where you'd go ahead in your preferences in workspace to change how you're seeing that naming here.
Right. So there's another question also. When changing the gating of one of the samples, do we need to apply the changes to all of the samples?
Good question. So what's going to happen sometimes is you might have scatter that might be shifting a little bit. Maybe your cells become activated and the scatter changes, or you might have expression levels going down or up. So you can adjust gates specific to the sample, but that's also experiment dependent, right? So I might go ahead and I might change some singlet gates and some singlet gates and some fluorescent gates as I see fit, but that's, you don't have to keep everything exactly the same all the time. There might be certain scenarios where you're keeping it exactly the same, but that's kind of experiment specific. For the most part, if you're just looking at levels of expression and positive and negative, you can adjust those gates because there will be slight differences. And it's not a hard line you need to keep it here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's it for questions. I mean, we have the question of the beads versus cells. Then maybe we can just address it very quickly and just, I guess we can promise that we'll be coming back to maybe a more in-depth tutorial on compensation and talk about beads versus cells.
Yeah.
But I would just say that, you know, the question really is not whether one is better than the other, because there are situations where we cannot use cells. I mean, ideally we would use cells, but there are many situations like when you have, you know, a patient sample that you can't use for compensation controls, or if the expression is very dim and you can't really use it as a compensation control. I mean, there are many reasons why it would be difficult to use cells. In that case, we need to use beads. Unfortunately, there are some instances where beads don't work very well. They don't mimic exactly the you know, what we see with the cells. So the answer really is sometimes one is better, sometimes the other one is better. We really, you know, what's recommended is to use both for the first time. But Kathy and I have actually been working with our team on this, and we've realized that even in situations where you see that things are working well, they may not work well, you know, in the next experiment and the other day. So so far, you know, we're trying to figure out what are the differences, why are the differences, and see if the vendors can step up and actually start producing, you know, beads that will be mimicking as much as possible what we see with the cells. Do you want to add anything, Kathy?
Yeah, one thing to add, especially since this is, you know, a basics class and stuff like that, is I want to make sure that everyone, I stress to everyone the importance and reiterate the importance of cells and beads and making sure that the negative is correct for each one. So, for example, in Diva or in some other softwares, if you don't, if you use a universal negative that are cells, but then your beads are all single color, you need to make sure that you address that either in FlowJo or in the acquisition software, and there are methods for that. And we also have SOPs on our website that go into the P3 gating method for Diva, and I can bring that up if I have to. The other thing that's important is please make sure that when you're doing the compensation that the fluorochromes match up with your experimental fluorochromes. So for example, you can't replace FTSE with GFP, or you can't say, oh, well, PAC blue replaces my BB421, it's the same detector. That is going to cause problems in your compensation that we can't do anything to correct for without the appropriate single colors. So just make sure that that's something you're mindful of also, that not everyone might be aware of.
Right, there's one question that came up now, which I think is interesting for everyone. Whereas so somebody was asking, Luke was asking, there are beads, any beads that work with viability dyes?
Yes, so that's a great question. There are different types of viability dyes. So you have the DNA binding dyes, like you know, you have DAPI, you have PI. There aren't beads available for those. You'd have to use cells. But then there are also the amine reactive or fixable amenable viability dyes. Those will go ahead and they'll stain surface amines on live cells, and then they'll also be able to get in through the permeable cell membrane of dying or dead cells and stain at a higher level for those. They have created, and there are ARC amine beads that are used for compensation for those. My personal experience is they're kind of hit or miss. My personal suggestion that I give to people, that's my personal, it's not the you know, general accepted standard per se, is to use a heat-killed cell mixed with your live cells as a single color, even if there are beads available, like the ARC amines. I don't love them, and I've had some issues now and again. So even though there are beads available, I'd ask to use cells. And you could use, if you're using tissue, you could still use a cell line for the viability control, as long as you're using a heat-killed sample that has enough dead cells in them and referencing the correct fluorescence. If you're working with
and
pressure.
Luke is also asking if they work well with zombie dyes in your experience. Do you have any experience with that, Kathy?
With the ARC amine and zombies? Just in general, they're going based on the same principle with the amine reaction,
Exactly.
so it should work. But I've just found that the autofluorescence of those beads and shifts up when you're adding in the viability dye. I just don't love them in general. So I wouldn't necessarily use that as my first suggestion for anybody unless it was absolutely necessary, because I've seen some issues with them. But again, that's my personal experience. I can't speak for other people.
Right. Okay, so one last question, since we should really wrap up. Is the results, or are the results of the same samples analyzed by DIVA and FlowJo the same?
So if you analyze in FlowJo and DIVA, would it come out the same? The simple answer is no. It will never be exactly the same, because unless you put every single node in the exact same place, there are going to be differences. You also have to be mindful, have you set everything up in the exact same way? You know, because you can't transfer over gating from DIVA into FlowJo. You just can't do it at this point. There are some more advanced things that you can do with newer BD platforms, with the sorters and everything like that, with high parameter stuff. That's not what this is about. But if you set up your gating strategy in DIVA or Insight Expert, in SpectroFlow, whatever instrument you're using, when you go to recreate, there are always going to be slight differences. It should mostly be similar, but it's never going to be exactly the same unless you're really, really good at setting nodes in the exact same space.
Right. It should be stressed that you should have the same results, but they're not going to be exactly the same, because there's always some you know, differences in the way you draw a gate, right? But they should be roughly the same, and you should get you know, the same end results in your hypothesis testing. Exactly.
But if you're looking for like a 0.0 or 10.0034 to be exactly 10.0034 across both platforms, those single events that you're going to see are going to start to come into play a lot more there, unless you have them completely the same. You know, again, reiterating what Rui said, for the most part, your answer biologically is going to be the same. It's just your exact numbers won't match up, but they should be very, very close.
Right. Okay. I think that is it for now.
Awesome. Again, sorry, go ahead, Ree.
Yeah, no, I was just going to ask, do we have any idea of what will be the next theme for next week? Some people were asking about that.
Oh, so I think
the topic for next week.
Some people weren't going to be able to attend this week, so I think we're going to do like a general basics of FlowJo, overviewing the same topics, and then we're going to add on different topics to different sessions. But what we can do, if I see a lot of people, you know, that are trying to attend multiple sessions just in basics, I think everyone now has my email and Rui's email. I'll ask you to reach out to us specifically if there are certain content areas you'd like us to go over, because as we're expanding this, we're doing the basics from week to week, so it's going to be somewhat similar, but we're going to be adding on different different sessions that will go over different content. So from week to week, it will be similar for this specific session, but for others, we're going to be adding on. And if you'd like to see any specific things, you know, just reach out. And we did have the responses from the survey that we're going to be going over and coming up with like maybe a more advanced or topic specific shorter sessions like proliferation, cell cycle, plate editor, any of that stuff.
Right. Okay, I think that's it.
Yeah, and again, thank you to everyone. We really appreciate you taking the time. And, you know, we hope everyone stays safe. That's the main concern, and we're really happy to have met everyone and hope for the best. Okay, thanks, guys.
Okay, thank you.